much, much a broader subject area, which concerns internal, external, different types of mechanism, different types of aspects of governance. So already by having taken a very generic approach to it, you're kind of lost. You have too many things. And even when you read a paper, sometimes you find actually what is the focus of this paper? Why are we discussing the literature in such a vast way? Where in fact, I was interested at the very beginning around boards, so around board characteristics or board structures. So that is the first thing. That is, and then as soon as your literature review has started off as a process to be too generic, then everything else will be too generic, and you will lose a message. The other extreme, however, is too specific or too partial. So in other words, it's a kind of hot and cold. It's either very hot or it's very cold. So it's either you're too generic or you're too specific and partial. In other words, you have decided to focus on board characteristic, but now you've really narrowed it so tightly, but you are actually not able to tease out something new out of this, right? So you might be saying, I am studying board independence. And there's so many studies around board independence, there's so many literature around board independence, but in fact, you're trying to read the literature on board independence, but you're missing many important points because you have narrowed it too much. Okay, so what we end up very often is replicating. So often with these sort of situations, people tend to replicate a lot of research because the literature has been so narrow and they just didn't. So one thing that I encourage people is obviously you want to bring a certain amount of focus, but too much, and then you get in trouble. You don't necessarily have something that will help you. And finally, that's why I encourage people, okay, you might be interested in board characteristics, you might be interested in board structures, but thinking beyond accounting, thinking beyond the classic accounting governance literature, what do they say about board characteristics in other areas, like management, organization, sustainability? So you kind of slowly get out there. So my point is that's the first step, the first challenge, I think, by literature when you're trying to bring your emphasis. Now, and this is an important bit, the process of a literature review does not usually translate into the writing. So it doesn't mean that because I have read all these papers, I'm going to write something now, and that will be the final article, the final output in my work, whether it's an article, whether it's a dissertation, whether it's a chapter, whatever it is, this is not what you're going to end up with. Okay, so you do literature review in the first instance, really to develop that sort of confidence around the topic, but doesn't mean that it eventually just turns out to be the process and the writing of the same things. So how do we embed the literature in a research article or dissertation? That's the other thing. Is literature review, and literature doesn't mean that the review somehow there's only one section in the paper or in the thesis. Literature is everywhere, right? So I'm not going to go into the detail, but you can imagine you use the literature at the beginning to problematize your questions, your motivations, your contributions. Then obviously, we're going to come to that, is what happens in the literature review section. How do you enable a focus on the debate, and then justify the research questions and the apparent, I hate the word, I don't want to use the word gap, because that's actually a big problem, in the sense that it's not necessarily about a gap in the real sense of it. It's about finding something that will help extend or better understand what the literature is saying. All right. So sometimes gap leads to a particular mechanical idea. There's a little gap here, we have to fill it. No, it doesn't mean that this gap needs addressing. There needs to be a better understanding of why there is no research about this. Someone today was presenting their PhD and saying, there is no research in this country oh, there's no research about this topic in this country. And I said, do we need to have? What is the underlying argument that we need to study this phenomena in this country? So there must be some sort of reason that underpins this. The gap doesn't imply it has to be done. So that's the first thing. Then the literature obviously feeds into your methodology, the literature feeds into discussion of results, your theoretical conclusions, and finally, in terms of how do you answer the question? Do you bring your contribution to the literature? It's often that when you actually read the concluding part of a paper, you are desperately reading, what was the introduction, what was the problem in the literature that you are trying to address. And then you are, as a reader, you're reading the conclusion saying, where is the answer to that research question, and what literature specifically is being there's a contribution to, right? What are we trying to contribute to? And often I can tell you there's very little, right? So it's almost like being an author, myself and others, we kind of forget by the time we write that last part. We forgot what was it we were doing, or what literature are we contributing to. So we have to be reminded almost by reviewers and the editors. But tell me, what is it that you are going to be contributing to what literature? Okay, so it's an important point, and until you do that, you haven't really closed the loop. Okay, so that brings us to, that's what I'm wanting to at least get a sense. 2 points here is what we mean by literature review in terms of focus, in terms of being too generic versus too specific. And then the second thing what I wanted to highlight is that when we're talking about literature and engagement with literature, it's obviously throughout the paper or throughout the work. It's not just about one chapter. It's not just about, oh, what I'm doing now, I'm just writing my literature review. Of course, writing your literature review chapter will mean that whatever you are putting there becomes a basis that is being fed in the introduction, methodology, discussion, conclusion. I hope I'm making sense in that. Maybe it's straightforward and common sense, but as I say, it's not always obvious when you read the final outcome. Right. I mean, these are different sort of definitions around what is literature review, and here the contrast is used to annotated biography. So people may write what X has done, what X has done, and what X is finding, and all of this. And very often we may read a paper and we may be able to write, we may be able to annotate. Basically we're just simply saying, describing what each paper or which source is telling us. That isn't a literature review, right? That isn't a literature review. You're just kind of really putting in a sort of organized way, if you want, what is it that paper X has done, paper Y has done, paper Z has done, and so on and so forth. And then, obviously, you're going to write a literature review that brings together these different aspects in a way that makes it coherent with the research question you're answering. Okay, so you may have a body of understanding, you have done your literature review, your literature search, but then you're going to use it based on whatever objective you're going to be focusing on. So either you're writing a thesis, either you're writing a dissertation, either you're writing one paper, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's how I see it. Now, again, something that is probably very straightforward, very obvious, but I want to mention it is, well, what do we need to do a literature review, right? It isn't, and it doesn't stop at just simply making a list of papers published in that field. It's about clearly a critical thinking about this work, right? So it's need to develop a critical thinking of that work. So reading it, understanding it, what are the papers trying to tell you? If I want to understand board structure, for example, board characteristics, company boards, I need to be able to read this work and then make a critical perspective about this work. Okay, so what do we need as skills? Well, we clearly need some skepticism, because anything that is written is by nature tends to be seen as authoritative. So you read an article, you might think, oh, this is so good, this is written by this person, it must be brilliant. So I have nothing to say against it. And that's more common than you think. But actually, no, you need to read it and you need to have that engagement, that skeptical engagement about the work. What is the work trying to claim? What is the work trying to say? And whether it's really, really changing perspectives. That means you need to understand it. You need to be able to look at this paper and say, does it look plausible to you? Does it look that it makes sense? Does the interpretation by the authors, we may read the same finding and then come to a different interpretation, right? The author might decide, I interpret this result in this way, or this is my result. And then you say, well, actually, there may be a different interpretation, right? So sometimes people, I was reading a work today, a draft of a PhD student saying, oh, we don't find any relationship between X and Y. Therefore, we are saying, this challenges the theory and so on and so forth and so forth. And I said, well, yeah, that's one explanation, but you may have other explanations, perhaps methodological explanations, measurement explanations, statistical explanations as to why there's no relationship between X and Y. So we need to be able to understand these different alternative perspectives. We need to be able to analyze the evidence from multiple sources. We need to be able to have an open mind. We need to be able to, evaluate the evidence in a systematic way. If we are doing, for example, quantitative research, it is quite common to have a table of all the previous papers, let's say on board structures or board characteristics, and looking one by one systematically for the last 10 years, all the studies done on board independence, for example, or board structures, what are the key findings from all these papers in a systematic, organized way, right? And that's one thing that often we don't see in a literature review. People don't necessarily communicate how systematic it was carried out, okay? Did you run a search of all the work in all these journals on this topic, right? Did you look at the last 5 years, the last 10 years of work on board characteristics in emerging economies? Did you do that? Okay. Which journal did you identify? So that gives you the systematic and the confidence to make conclusions as a result of that. But I also want to conclude that this is not just about critiquing. It's not about saying something is wrong, but rather to be able also to evaluate and positively comment when you think this is a brilliant piece of work. There's always going to be, whichever piece of work you're doing, there's always going to be, and I'm sometimes a little bit concerned when I ask this question and I don't get an answer, is when I ask a student or an early career, say, you're doing this topic on board characteristics, or you're doing this topic on accounting, management accounting systems, for example. Which key paper is guiding your work? Which key paper or papers is guiding your work? Yeah, what sort of literature is taking you? And I'm amazed, I have to tell you, well, slightly disappointed that sometimes people can't even give that answer, right? It can't even tell me what's the paper. And that's tells you something about, your ability to say, okay, I have a few key papers that I'm using. Right. Again, I don't want to spend too much time here on this point, but really, people keep saying, well, okay, you want us to be critically analyzing. What does that mean? I mean, a few years ago, if Egbon is around, he probably will remember this, that we had to come up with explanations to students, because we tell students you have to do a literature review, and students were like, undergraduate students, I have no idea what you mean. What do you mean by this? So we had to really explain, what does it mean to be critical, right, with a paper. So for example, describing it, explaining what the topic is about, analyzing what we're finding, and 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 the so what, right? So the what, the how, the why, and so what, right? So if you read a paper, if you're trying to analyze an article or a series of articles, then clearly you are describing, you're explaining, you're analyzing, and then the consequence of that research. Okay, what is going on? How is that happening? Why do you think it's happening? Why does the author think this is happening? And so what? What's the conclusion of that result? Okay. So if you are really talking about critical analysis, if you're talking about, then as you go down, your level of critical analysis increases. Okay. So I think I had a simple example to show here. If I can find the document. Because I was trying to show a document where we had done this at the time. Let me just see if I can still find it. In terms of, give me a second. I'm assuming I don't share any more of the screen. No, I can stop sharing. Let's see if I can get this document here. Right, here we are. Right, this is just really, it won't take long. I'm going to share this. Right. Yeah. So this is an example. I don't know if you can see this. Am I sharing? Yeah, I'm sharing a PDF. So I'm just going very quickly because I don't want to repeat the same things. But, for example, this was an interesting one, right? If you read a sentence like this, Benston 2014 argued that principle-based standards are better than rule-based standards. Powers suggest otherwise. This is what we call a descriptive statement, right? That's it. Or Benston argued that principle-based standards are better than rule-based standards because they help to reduce creative accounting. Powers suggests rules-based standards are more appropriate as they provide bright line tests and reduce ambiguity. So now we're describing and we're explaining why the authors reached a conclusion. Okay, so something as simple as that. I know it is a bit basic, but I think I wanted to at least say that's what I mean by making your writing in a more critical sense. Okay. And then there are some more examples here, but I will come to it again. But I can share that afterwards. But this is an example of how you try to make people think about, in this case here, got there, yeah. But example number 3, Powers argues in favor of this, easier to apply. In contrast, advocates of principle-based standards better. Despite the fact they introduce subjectivity in professional journalism, criticize they reduce creative accounting through the removal of legal loopholes by the bright line. Creative accounting is a significant cost to society, therefore principle, and so on. So we describe, analyze, explain, and explain the so what. Why does it matter if we have rule-based or principle-based standards? Okay. So these three statements, if you want, or these three demonstrate a little bit this example of going beyond the description. Because I can tell you, when I read literature reviews, I often see this. I don't go more than that. Often people just see this and then stop. And so therefore the engagement with literature, the sort of connection you're trying to make and the sort of critical analysis here doesn't quite get there. I hope I'm making sense in that way. And I can share this obviously later on. Okay, and of course, I mean that means there's different ways of writing literature reviews, different ways. I'm not trying to say this is the only way, or in one way or another. Okay, so it's just a sort of example here. Right, let me move on back to my screen if I can find it now. Share. Do you see my slides again? Yeah, good. Okay, right. So let's move on. So as I said, we did this exercise. And then if I wanted to get back to this title of compelling or crucial or important literature review, so what makes really a compelling literature review? Well, firstly, unless you have a research question, an initial research question at least, you're not writing a literature review, right? So that's clear. You need to have that initial research question. Might be an initial set of research questions. You might change it afterwards. But if I want to study, for example, to what extent do board characteristics contribute to company performance? Okay, so that means I've got my keywords. I will start identifying the work around board characteristics, performance, and these keywords, and start looking. Board characteristics can be different things: diversity, age, independence, a number of different things. So I could start now identifying that. You need to identify key issues, themes, theories, and methods. Okay, so in any sort of literature, what is the key debate? What is the key debate you're trying to find here, right? For example, in the case of bowel characteristics, despite what has been written, there's a lot of concern about, whether these fixed characteristics, whether these, because this is usually in standards and codes and pronouncement, whether these fixed characteristics can really matter or not, or do we have something more complex going on? So the key issues is there. The themes could be around, for example, the type of characteristics, the type of characteristics, whether they are independent, whether they are different diversity, and so on and so forth. The theories, quite important. What are the theories underpinning this relationship? If I'm deciding to study board characteristics and performance, bearing in mind performance doesn't mean financial performance, could be any sort of performance. So what are the theories underlying these particular relationships? Often, is almost an implicit, and I'll come back to this, implicit idea, agency theory, and nothing else. We're not discussing other theories where there are clearly other theories. And then the other important point is, as you obviously developed your literature review, you obviously an element of that, an important element is methods. How you're going to study this, how you're going to calculate, you're going to measure and run, mostly quantitatively. The way I'm framing my question is inevitably a functionalist question. So I'm asking a question that is much more functionalist. So therefore, I will probably be looking at quantitative methods, large-scale survey, large-scale studies, using archival data, and so on and so forth. So what sort of methods do we have? Now, the features also, so key themes, issues, theories, and methods. So we try to find the cutting across themes, the cutting across elements, right? Of course, it demonstrates your knowledge of a topic and the main contribution of the papers you are citing. It should be relatively exhaustive, right? But we know now, if you search board characteristics on Scholar Google, if you search various topics on Scopus, you will find thousands of articles. That's clear. But what are the seminal articles? What are the recent developments in evidence? And what is known about evidence from the country in particular, right? So you might be clearly one of the themes could be international evidence, local evidence, Arabic evidence, and so on and so forth. So you could be, yeah. I always try to, eventually, we want to develop a conversation with a body of knowledge and a way to tease out the research problem, right? So as we are reading all these papers, a sort of pattern develops as to what I think may be a problem or a challenge within that literature. It is not a gap in the sense of it. It is more of something has been forgotten, right? We forgot to discuss this. So for example, for a long time, people have done board characteristics, board diversity, and generally understood to be gender diversity. And then now there are various aspects of diversity that have not been considered. So that's a problematization of the literature. We are looking at very visible, very one-sided element of diversity, whereas there are other aspects of diversity that might come into play, or we are putting away these things. We might be focusing on performance in a financial sense. We may be interested in the functional characteristics in terms of financial performance, whereas in fact, boards are much more concerned around process, strategy formation, improving the quality of decision making. So maybe we are simply, by putting performance on the other side of the equation, we're simply just overreaching our research. We're just not going in the right direction. What we should be focusing on is processual outcomes from this. So that could be, and I agree, and I can tell you that very confidently because I know I've done that literature. I know confidently that we are just focusing on something that's way, way, way forward, whereas we should be looking at other ways to measure outcomes. So that's what I mean by developing a a conversation with literature, a way to tease out the research problem, right? It is not simply just a matter of saying there's a gap there. I'm acutely aware that people like this idea of a gap. But the problem is the gap in isolation of a context that you're looking at, in isolation of literature, the whole body of knowledge, chances are you're going to miss it. It's going to find something, find a gap, but it's not really that important, that relevant. Okay. Then, of course, coherence of arguments, clear and effective referencing. I'm going to continue on this. Are we okay so far? People can hear. I'm not just talking in a blank screen. Yeah, everyone's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, everything's
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just making sure I'm not going to. Yeah. So what are we time-wise? Okay. Right. Now, again, we wanted to explain to people in the simplest way possible what are the do's and don'ts of a literature review section, whether it's in your chapter, whether it's in, and so we kind of said, well, all the green stuff is what we want, highlighting conflicting evidence and areas of controversy, identifying weaknesses or limitations in studies, identifying further potential research, distinguish between fact and opinion. Okay, so really having a difference between saying these researchers have found this based on a fact, because of on their empirical findings. I think, or I believe, or I'm questioning some of these issues within that paper. So that's an opinion, right? It has to be up to date. It has to be up to date. And then, in a sense, we need to have that not mechanical, but conscious thinking every time to say, what is it that we know and what is it that we don't know? What is it that we have been able to know? What is it that we don't know enough of, right? And often remember, the whole process here is about arguing why your study is important, arguing why your study might contribute to why your research question might contribute to the overall literature. Okay, so I think this is where we often, I think, undersell, or we sell it the wrong way. For example, this person today said, I will want to do this important topic in this country because it hasn't been done in this country. My argument to this person was, no. There is a bigger debate globally around this. So your work contributes to the bigger debate, right? It happens to be in that country. And surely there may be particular social, political, cultural context that will influence what you're going to see. But first and foremost, your literature is your work is trying to bring some knowledge to a wider audience. So you try as best to do that. And the wider audience doesn't mean US people or UK people. It means the audience that you are talking to, that you're reviewing your literature. So it might be an emerging economy literature. It might be corporate governance in Africa. It might be corporate governance in Asia. That's the sort of area we are trying to go in. So it's not just a matter of trying to get published in US, whatever. Now, so that's what I mean by the do's. What is, and you will find, for example, in quantitative type studies, papers, articles, we tend to almost connect the review of a literature to the hypothesis. So in other words, most of the papers, most of the articles now in quantitative research, it's not necessarily there's a big text of literature and then you write your separate hypothesis and whatever. No, you actually bring together focused literature on a hypothesis number 1, 2, and 3. So I want to understand what is the relationship between, let's say, board independence and performance. Then I will kind of go through that review and theoretical arguments. Why do I think there is a need to study this? What is the tension that I'm trying to bring in the literature? What is the tension I'm trying to bring in a hypothesis? And therefore, the hypothesis and the literature are basically one, right? It's not separate, right? And you may have a second hypothesis, a third hypothesis, and so on and over. Incidentally, something for the benefit of people who are doing quantitative research, please bring attention in your hypothesis. Your attention as in a debate, a real question in a sense, right? Often people write hypothesis in a one-sided way. Oh, we know it's positive, and therefore we are testing if it's positive. No, you must bring attention. You must be able to say, there is still a debate. There's still different theoretical arguments. There's still conflicting evidence as to the role of this particular board structure on performance. Thereby, that's why I'm doing this hypothesis. So the hypothesis must embed attention. If you haven't got attention, you haven't got a hypothesis, right? So always test yourself by reading a hypothesis, looking at the arguments you've used in the literature, your theoretical concepts and ideas, and when you put it together, it must sense like there is a question, a real question to be asked. Otherwise, it just looks like I'm just repeating the same thing that others have done. And finally, on the other side, as I said, well, forget the paper by paper summary. Uh, you know, I can still see that. We can still do a lot of that. Probably as a writing up literature review, people can start writing 5, 6 pages and saying X done that, Y has done that, W's done this, Z has done that. But then as you write this, after about 3 or 4 pages, this is the moment where you say, well, okay, oh, so Z and A are saying something similar, or Y and X are arguing about methods. And so you try then to start reorganizing your literature in a more active way, rather than keeping the same sort of paper by paper or whatever the case may be. So no synthesis, no particular themes, that's where you're going to be a problem. Right, these are straightforward things. As I said, same sort of approach to literature reviews. We as we become more trained in reading papers, we obviously not we don't read papers from start to finish. You kind of try to get a sense of what are we trying to do, what's the abstract saying, what's the introduction, what's the method, and then try to bring together. So I know where the things are in the paper. So therefore, I'm not really reading a paper from start to finish, but I'm trying to understand the key points between that. This is an example of what I encourage everyone to do. And, everyone must be, when they are doing these sort of literature reviews, and the systems are already doing it for you, in a way, you could easily organize your literature around a topic, in terms of this. And it's easier then to see the commonalities, the differences, the challenge, the contrasts, and so on and so forth. It's easy then to write. It's easy for me then to, for example, say, if I take this example on a slide here, which is nothing to do with me, but let's say, I can then say various studies have started to look at AI adoption in higher education, following developments of in adopting more IT and sort of digitalization in universities. So I can kind of write something around the context of research and the scope. I can then write a section on theory. Different theories have been put forward, some of them focusing on the technical aspects of innovation versus the aspects of how does it help the student to improve its learning. So you have 2 theories. I'm just kind of using, you can easily then write something much more engaging when you have this material in front of you, rather than necessarily just writing papers by papers. So I think that's and then of course as you read those papers, you develop your critique, your failings, the gaps, the things that you see are missing. Maybe they've missed the wrong variable, and so on and so forth. And so that helps. So I think really given that, I'm going to skip on that, but I think these are examples of how people develop over time. When you read more and more papers, when you read more and more articles, you develop a sort of confidence about your topic, and you are able to confidently stand up and say, what do I think the research is about? What do I think the position of the research has been in the past? What do I think the research hasn't yet quite done, right? And so, I'm not trying to pit these 2 statements on the screen, but you can see, in a sense, if you want a more descriptive nature on the governance example versus the mention about home here. So in a sense, you can see a little bit more engagement, confidence of what the literature is about and why am I going to be studying this. Whereas the other one is a much more pedestrian type of approach to research. You know, this is the context, this is what happened in corporate governance, and that's why we're going to do this. But it's not necessarily doing a good job at arguing, at making a case for why am I studying this again? Right. I'm going to skip on this. I think I can talk about that. There are different ways of talking about, as I said, the best type of literature reviews is always, trying to compare, right? Trying to bring some comparison. So either you're comparing the different perspectives, sometimes maybe there are different concepts around, let's say, management accounting, right? Or management accounting innovations, maybe different sort of um, understanding of management accounting innovations. I just took that as an example. And so you could be first doing simply the different viewpoints and definitional viewpoints. You know, different authors have over time looked at definitionally, at conceptually at what is management accounting innovation. So you could be doing almost comparing the views of different authors. And then you also look at themes. So you could be identifying as you've done your sort of here, how you've done this, and you come up with particular themes. And you can say, so people are looking at corporate governance, they're looking at board independence, they're looking at board diversity, they're looking at board structure, they're looking at committees. So each of these words I'm using could be themes by which I could organize my literature review. Right? So I could be looking, okay, there are 5 different key aspects being researched in the literature. If I take board diversity, you've got gender, you've got ethnic diversity, you've got age diversity, you've got qualifications diversity, you've got educational, expertise diversity. So you could have 5 subheadings looking at what's been done about each of these types of diversity. So you think of a theme, and then that is much, much easier, much more interesting to talk about. And because that often leads to, especially in a quantitative type research, it leads to your hypothesis. It leads to your argument you're going to make, the multiple facets of diversity in this case. You can also think chronologically, but I have to admit sometimes this doesn't necessarily do a good job. It's not just a matter of saying X did this in 2005, 2007, 8, 9, 10. It might be useful, as I said here, analyzing the development of ideas over time. But that's not always the case. So here are some examples of that sort of text, when you're comparing the views of different authors. There's a general consensus regarding viewpoints. So you can see here, it is mechanical. I take it. We don't write, everyone doesn't have to have write it in that way. But I think these style of writing almost compels you as a writer to get into the comparison business, to get into the highlighting contradictions, highlighting commonalities, highlighting themes of interest, themes that come back once more and more. So it kind of forces you to write the literature in that way, right? It may not be the natural way for many people to necessarily write something, but that forces you to think how you're going to make your arguments, okay? Because I think sometimes clearly when you're reading a paper, someone has spent 6 months writing that paper, and therefore to me, it seems to me that this person clearly has done the work, but then now trying to translate this into a set of arguments that will be publishable would be, is where the challenge is. How much to review? I think that's a big question. I think it's often down to access to be able to analyze this literature. I am a little bit concerned. There are bibliographic methods. There are software, which is now very popular, where you throw in a lot of papers and it tells you all sorts of connections and all of this. By all means, use them. But please don't use them directly in a paper, right? Because I think they are very good at giving a descriptive hindsight on things, right? They tend to give you a descriptive aspect on things, but it doesn't really, it's not the literature review. It's just to help you to do that. So many people, I'm an associate editor of a journal of accounting literature. Many people are sending literature review paper, which are basically outputs from these bibliometric methods, bibliometric software or whatever. And that's absolutely not going anywhere because basically they're just description and they're not really putting together perspective of people here. Right. So I'm going to move on, but this is the part about I wanted to do about literature review. So I think in a sense, if I wanted to conclude about this is to really reflect a lot on how you organize your literature at the beginning, how you classify your literature at the beginning, so that it allows you to do this. It allows you to do these comparisons, these contrasts. So, something as simple as this, something as simple as this. Just write your papers, organize your papers, and see how it helps you identify the commonalities and similarities. Okay. Okay. That brings me a little bit to the end of that section. Do you want me to continue? There are some resources here I've put here. Do you want me to continue on the second part?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Okay, good. All right. Right. So, okay. So I'm going to move on. So, in a sense, Shazad kind of highlighted this point before that important to talk a little bit about the quantitative aspects of research. So, and especially because we receive many papers. So I wanted to do that part. It's not so long, so I hope that's not going to be too much if people are assuming in quantitative research compared to those who are in qualitative. Firstly, one thing which is important when we try to get into that style of accounting research, clearly we are in a very interesting time because we can study accounting into so many ways. So that's the first thing I want to highlight. Maybe it's not always the case that people realize this, but we are studying accounting in so many different perspectives. We are studying accounting, not only financial accounting, we're studying accounting from a sustainability point of view. We're studying accounting from a charitable point of view. We look at sustainable development goals. For example, people talk about sustainable development goals. Well, guess what? Somewhere, if you think of country targets, somewhere in every country, there must be people adding up these numbers. There must be people, adding up the SDG 1 targets, SDG 2 targets, SDG 3, 4, and 4 and 5. There must be a system to collect this. There must be a system to account for this. There must be a system to report on this. So that is accounting. That is also accounting, right? So it's also different sort of accounting technologies that are everywhere in public sector, in tax, and so on and so forth. Even when it comes to governance, I was talking about governance before. Even if I talk of governance, there's a lot around the disclosure of governance, the reporting of governance. How does an organization communicate its commitment to governance? That's different from the governance itself, the exercise of governance, the process of governance, but equally, how does it communicate to its external parties and to its stakeholders? How is governance implemented? And that itself is one of the sort of research I've done a couple of times. And it's really fascinating because it's about how companies explain the process that they take. Okay, so all of these are governance aspects. Now, we are studying emerging economies. That's the other thing. We're studying emerging economies. And I think I don't intend to, I'm assuming Shazad in some way or another must have covered this in a way that, we're not trying to define emerging economies necessarily in a purely traditional economic sense, right? It started like this, yes, and the classification still exists in various international bodies around economic GDP targets. They also now around health, education, and so on and so forth. So there is some attempts to classify countries based on their performance in financial as well as health, education, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of what people call emerging economies or developing economies or and so on and so forth. But as I'm sure Shazad's talked about, he says, no, let's forget about all this. Let's call them majority world, because in any way, it is not purely an angle or a dimension of financial or development. It is also an angle about everything else that is different about these countries, or at least that do not necessarily claim to be of a Western kind of construction. So US, UK, and some European countries, and for example. So therefore, when we talk of emerging economies, in a sense, it's the wrong word, I agree. It is talking about a number of social political groupings that may have some characteristics that I've defined, I've provided here, but some of these characteristics may not apply to all countries. So you may have MENA. If you think of MENA, Middle East and North Africa, there's so much variations in itself. So even if you say something called MENA, it doesn't mean you have in that same category extremely rich, extremely small population with extremely rich countries, all the way to countries that are more populous but not as rich, and having a sort of different types of political systems, different types of religious systems and economic systems. So there may be some commonalities, but so you can see that there's strong variations between them. So when you actually think of researching into this now, so you're thinking, okay, I want to study emerging economies, and very early on, as I said, my own experience is you say, oh, I want to write about Mauritius. I want to write about my country. Why should we? Because I come from there. I want to publish, and there's nothing like I said before. Oh, no one's written about this, so maybe I should write about Mauritius. But then the problem is, what do I research it about? What should I research about, right? And many people in the majority world, in emerging economies, are in the same sort of boat. We are academics. I did a visit to South Africa a few weeks ago, and there's absolute enthusiasm to be involved in research. Many good PhD students, early careers, trying to write research, but they're trying to think themselves, what do I want to research on, right? About South Africa, for example. Okay. And so when you actually look at the study, you study all the papers, and this is it's a bit older paper now, but this is still a good literature review of all, a review of all the articles published in developing countries. You will find that most of the studies that are trying to be done in those countries are basically a replication of research questions in UK, US, and Western Europe, right? So the vast majority, I won't dare to put a number, but it's the vast majority of research questions and problematizations are influenced by the key settings in the literature. So having seen a study on board independence and performance in the UK, I set about to do a study of board independence and performance in Mauritius, right? Now, without necessarily perhaps even appreciating in my mind that the concept of independence is quite different. What we understand as independence. If you have a population of 1.5 million people, an elite group of, let's say, 300 directors in the whole country, what independence are we talking about? As opposed to a UK setting, a US setting, and so on and so forth. So often we end up replicating those particular approaches without necessarily thinking how these settings are different. Okay? And that is still a major challenge that we want to move people. I mean, I'm not saying you cannot replicate. I'm not saying you cannot replicate at all, but I'm trying to say that this inevitably, brings you in a route where you end up with similar results. That is the reality. Okay, so you end up saying, "Oh, I found a positive relation between board independence and performance in Palestine." Right. So what is the immediate response by the reviewers? We already know that. So this is where I think by many people still take that route. And in some cases, it might be totally appropriate. But in many cases, I have to say it is basically just this sort of replication. The second category, and this is still, I think, a lot of possibilities here, is an investigation and the challenges about how international practices fare in emerging economies. It is clear that the majority world is a fertile ground for the implantation of implantation of international global practices. Okay, why is that? You may have different explanations. My explanation is it's about making money, right? It's about selling something to a different world. It may be not a product, may not be a McDonald's, it'll be something else, right? So this is often what happens is that a product, an accounting development, an accounting technology, sustainability reporting, let's call it sustainability reporting, is now being sold because it makes big bucks, because then you can sell this product to your companies, to your clients, and so on and so forth. But how do they actually work in practice is, again, a lot of paper. There've been a lot of papers, I think, in a sense, functionalist as well as critical, functionalist as well as critical viewpoint about the second bullet point here. So that is I would say, a slightly more interesting, albeit a lot of studies now go on to this, and we found similar results. So if you study this in Africa X, country X, you will find similar results in country Y, because even from a qualitative standpoint, you find similar studies. Finally, the third one is the one that has not been sufficiently looked at. Okay, wherever we go, what's happened to the local practices? Where are these local practices? How do they operate? So there have been accounting practices, there have been accountability practices, there have been governance practices. They operate anyway, or they've been operating in the past, or in some way or another, but we don't write sufficiently about it. Okay, I'll take an example because this is getting me really interested about this, is Africa. I'm reading a book about the history of the various kingdoms and the various civilizations that existed sub-Saharan Africa across the whole continent, and how there's so much interesting information about the accountability, the accounting, the governance, the financial practice. Some of them had currencies. Some of them had very detailed accounting standards, accounting reporting, but not much talked about, right? Equally, I'm not sure you even knew that there's the UNESCO project called the General History of Africa. There's actually a history, a proper project of African history by Africans, and that's been done by UNESCO. No one knows about it because obviously that's not the main history that people tend to learn. So basically my point is a lot more here to be done. I'm going to move on, with the context of research. One thing is obviously trying to make a case that you need more research that is more embedded in the context, but I don't think I need convincing here. One thing, for example, if I take the African example, 95% of research is done on large companies. Large companies represent 1% of business in Africa. 99% are small businesses. Okay, so basically this is a total mismatch between what we're trying to research versus the context in which we are researching. Now, that brings me a little bit now to what I mean on the quantitative research, right? Firstly, as you may know, or implied already, quantitative research adopts a sort of positivism, functionalist ideas. We are trying to study accounting as an objective reality. Many people in the room may not agree, and I totally agree as well. So we're trying to study accounting as an objective reality. And often when you're researching accounting as objective reality, that means that you need to make sure that the conceptual boundaries are clear, right? Right. So when people are writing a paper about earnings management, a paper or writing about IFRS adoption, a paper about management accounting system, there needs to be absolute clarity about that the conceptual boundary, because that's an objective construct. Yeah. And that's the first thing that goes wrong. Because when you start actually reading the paper, you realize that the person is talking about something different, right? It's quite often the case. So conceptual clarity about these concepts, these phenomena, because of an objective reality viewpoint, okay? And also, this presupposes, as I said by the example earlier on, this presupposes the coherence applies to a given context. So example, when I say independent directors on the board, I am almost now thinking in my mind the sort of classic Cadbury, US-based director. So it's almost like automatically you develop a sort of very what's the right word? Abstract nature of what an independent director. So that is often the problem about this. When you're going to be writing a quantitative research, you're also going to be thinking about the distinctiveness and the relevance of the research. Okay, why is it distinctive? Why is it relevant? So obviously, as you probably guessed at this point, if you're going to say this hasn't been done in this country before, that's not going to be sufficient. You will have to really come up with something that is distinctive and relevant to it. So for example, it might be that you accept that, independent directors really in Mauritius, for example, are not really independent. They are connected. So we accept at the very, very beginning that the concept here may be different. And we're trying, therefore, to understand the role of these connected directors, the role of these semi-independent, if you want, directors into this. So you're trying to bring some distinctiveness to what you're studying. And of course, in the quantitative research, we need a clear research question. What is the association? What is the effect of X? What is the effect of Y? If these questions are not there, then you're going to find it difficult. So in a sense, have a clear that. The other thing is, obviously, as I said, perhaps as I was talking about literature review before, literature review is really here helping us to develop a hypothesis rather than a broad brush of literature covering the topic. Okay, so literature review here helps us to just, if you can write a paper, and you will see many examples. I didn't necessarily pick up a lot of examples, but if you see many examples, you will find that it's much better to write your hypothesis almost as an output of your literature. So as you write that first section on hypothesis number one, you're doing your review, you're putting your theory, and you're getting your hypothesis. And then you move on to the next one and the next one and the next one. That makes it much easier. The other point, please do not send a paper for publication with 10 hypotheses, 12 hypotheses, 13 hypotheses. This really communicates the wrong message altogether. Maybe the perception is if I send as many hypotheses as possible, one or two will go through, whatever. But please do not do that. It has to be always a very limited number of hypotheses, 2 to 3. You're writing a 10,000, 8,000 paper, 2 to 3 hypotheses. If you have more, brilliant, keep it for the next paper. But don't do many. The rest can become, because what you're trying to demonstrate, you're trying to kind of say, in a way, there's a tension, there's a distinctiveness, there's a tension, there's an originality in 8 different ways or 10 different ways, whereas we know it's most likely 1 or 2. So focus only on that. Of course, does agency theory reflect all attitudes and behaviors? I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but you can expect here that as you start looking at other countries, you start looking at different types of relationships, family businesses. There's a paper I did, we did for Indonesia, and it was about family businesses. So we try to, obviously, we still use agency theory, but we focus on another type of agency problem. We're not the classic director, shareholder problem, but rather a problem between family and non-family, right? Family business, family owners versus non-family owners, okay? Recently, for those who may be interested, recently I read a very fascinating literature review around bank governance and how the problem is not so much between the executives and the shareholders, because in effect, the shareholders and the executives are together, because the shareholders invest a very small amount of equity. They want to leverage as much as possible the bank and make lots of money. So shareholders and managers are typically aligned. What they are not aligned with is the lenders and the depositors, because lenders and depositors, the people who actually finance the bank, would not like you to take too many risks, because then they are going to lose money. The government will have to intervene and the lenders will be out of pocket, right? So here the agency problem is not the same, right? And so this continuous idea of applying agency theory irrespective of what is actually the reality on the ground is the problem, right? So I think thinking of this, I'm not saying to dump agency theory, but really to think beyond simply this shareholder manager kind of tension. As I already said before, hypothesis highlighted tension at a conceptual level. So often what I see is people are measuring, let's say, board independence in a certain way or measuring performance in a certain way, and we're trying to highlight attention at the empirical level. No, the attention is at the conceptual level, right? So you're looking at the concept of board independence. You're looking at the concept of corporate performance. The measurement comes after, right? How are you going to actually do the stats? That's different. Okay, so but highlight the tension. Data, empirical model, and variables. This is where we get into a situation where you have to demonstrate the replicability of your research. So in other words, that's where people tend to obviously replicate. So that's where you get your replication from, because you're going to use the same variables, you're going to use the same. But the problem again, as I said, they may reflect different things in the country in particular, or the data may not be available, or there may be problems with that data. So it's something quite important to critically look at. There's also what I call a exclusion of financial firms. Actually, financial firms are very important, but often they are excluded, whereas actually you could find a way to exclude them, to include them. The biggest problem that I think we've had debates about is you need a large sample for statistical analysis. There's no way around this. There's absolutely no way around this. People are trying different things, but in the end, you need a large sample. What are you doing when you're doing a regression analysis? You're basically putting observations on a graph, and then you're trying to fit a line that sort of says that is the overall relationship. Now, if you have only a few points and they're going to be dotted everywhere, whatever you do, you're not going to end up with something that looks credible as a statistical analysis. Okay, so there's just no way out of this. The problem also is by expanding the data set by, let's say, putting panel data, having more years, again, we have a problem, right? It doesn't mean that the problem is solved by having more years, okay? For example, there is a lot of data that are time invariant. They don't move, they don't change a lot with time, okay? If I have 5 directors on the board, next year I may have 6. Then what? Maybe 6 again. 5 again, 6 again. So the variation in certain governance variables, for example, is very, very, very low, right? Or not at all. So having more years does not resolve the problem. Of course, for accounting type research, where you have accounting numbers, there will be more variations. But that's not the same for things like governance, other sort of typical variables of that nature. The other point I want to make, please assign some space for the descriptive aspects of the results. Sometimes a researcher, a paper comes with a very interesting phenomena. Okay, let's call them, I don't know, human rights disclosures, for the want of a better example. And you say, oh, this is really interesting, human rights disclosures. And you say, okay, great. So they make the argument, everything, they come to the findings. and the findings simply jumps from descriptive statistics, they just show some means, some descriptive statistics, and then straight to regression. I never get to see what type of disclosures is going on, what category of disclosures is happening, right? So basically, the descriptive story is gone, whereas perhaps 50% of the interesting bit is there, right? And typically for those who are in quantitative research, you're going to find, oh, there's a positive relationship between governance and human rights disclosures, or between size and we know that because these are just disclosures like every other disclosures. But what is interesting in the paper is the peculiarity of that disclosure. What are they telling us differently, or what are the variations in that disclosure? So my point I'm trying to make here is that descriptive is more important than the exploratory. Right? In this case, the descriptive could be more interesting than the explanatory model, right? Because we're going to find the same thing. And so if you have in your studies, in your research, very interesting type of disclosures, unique type of disclosures, then spend time writing about these disclosures, even in a descriptive sense, is more publishable, is more interesting than trying to run complex statistics. Not everything has to be in quantitative research ending up with a regression, right? Maybe this is a provocative statement, but this is my feeling that certain papers, and I've done some work, and I can show some examples of work where have you simply trends, averages over time, because that was enough. There was no need to do any more to tell to provide a contribution to the literature. Okay. In a way, I'm trying also to say that by doing these sort of complex regression analysis, sometimes you are putting yourself against a sort of test, a sort of criteria that inevitably reviewers will say, well, you haven't got enough data, you haven't got enough variables, you haven't got enough tests, and so on and so forth. So you're basically putting yourself, you're putting yourself to lose, really, or to be finding more difficulties. I'm nearly there. Many people also like to do quantitative research cross-country. Excellent. You might want to do MENA, GCC, all these sort of, you try to increase the data set by going abroad, in a sense. But at the very least, you need a country level variable. You'll need a country level variable. You can't just take all of it and say, oh, this is just one context. Of course, you need some sort of measure of a context. I've talked about time invariance. I've talked about pre and post analysis. For example, a lot of studies I've done is around regulatory change, what happens before, what happens after. And again, you have lots of possibilities here. So you could be studying that. There's now more and more in quantitative research what we call treatment and control groups. So people are trying to study a change, but when you study the change, you study the change to the treatment group, so the group that is supposed to adopt it, versus a group of companies that are not expected to follow it. Okay, so you're trying to actually do an experiment. Okay, so for example, there's a paper where we're looking at how pension accounting is adopted in the European context, right? So we look at that. And then what is a control group is American similar companies in America, because they are not expected to adopt. So we're looking for behavior, investment behavior of companies in Europe following the change in standard versus a context where there's investment behavior without the change in accounting standard. So you're able to kind of make a stronger statement that there is a change because of that particular change of accounting standard. Another point is often you will find quantitative papers where the title says this is board independence and performance, a new quadratic whatever method, or, and so on and so forth, a new statistical method. Now, you are basically saying that I'm using a new technique. But if a new technique ends up giving the same result as we knew before, but that's not making it publishable, right? So the new technique must be able to demonstrate a new agenda, a new item, a new concept, a new perspective to the results. If you find exactly the same results, then the problem is what is the contribution? So a new technique in itself does not justify necessarily publication. You need to be able to find something quite distinctive. Others are doing a lot more moderating and mediating effects. That's quite important. More and more, we're studying not just the relationship between X and Y, but whether Z influences that. And that's quite common. And that actually is a way forward in quantitative research beyond the direct effects. You know, there could be other factors, and that works quite well, I think, as an approach in many studies. A discussion of the results, I'll move that. That's okay. That's fine. That's where I think context will matter a lot. Even though you may not be in qualitative research, if you are understanding the context in which you are studying this, then this is where context. People often forget the context. The paper started off with board independence and whatever in Indonesia, then do the whole thing, and by the end we get standard results. Indonesia we don't see again. We don't see the country at all again afterwards. And that's a problem, because you said at the beginning you want to study this in your country, and that did not appear to be important in the end. Or you haven't necessarily perhaps make that context much more relevant. I will move on with that because I've just said this before. I call them soft quants. Consider soft quants approaches for a small sample size. It is possible to publish small sample size. It is possible to publish. If your country has only 20 companies, so be it. They have only 20 companies. There are only 30 companies. But then look for something that is descriptively interesting about this, right? Rather than trying to do a regression with 20 companies or 30 companies. Recently, I looked at a paper has been published from the special issue on MENA on inflation accounting in Lebanon, right? So it was about inflation accounting. It was a qualitative paper, but I'll be very interesting to know how the accounts are prepared, you know, a more sort of company by company account analysis of their disclosures, of their practices regarding inflation accounting, because there's no such very little papers published on inflation accounting altogether. So in a sense, and a descriptive element would be sufficient to bring a contribution to the literature. Okay, so that's an important point to bear in mind. Right, so I'm getting to my conclusion, and I think I'm hoping that's kind of I don't maybe I haven't gone into full details, but I'm obviously open to questions. So my sort of overall advice on this is obviously the literature review, we've already covered on that, and how you can obviously improve the quality of your literature review by using these simple tests of do's and don'ts, right? Improving the language and the writing. Consider opportunities beyond replication, right? So a paper that comes, but basically replicates without necessarily really thinking it through might have more difficulties publishing. Not every quantitative study requires linear regressions. Reflect on how to convey that's interesting moment for the reader. So think about the poor editor. Think of Shazad. He told me he's just back and he has hundreds of papers to read. So think of the editor. Think of a way to convince the editor this is something interesting. How do you bring context as much as possible in a paper? As much as possible. Bring context. How does it change the situation? There was a paper, I mean, the chapter I was reading for a PhD student today was saying, oh, I want to study this because of the enforcement and regulation systems in the country. But the person doesn't really explain what is happening. I can guess that the enforcement is terrible. I can guess that the situation is not as great as it looks, but the person is not really arguing that. And so that's what perhaps needs to come out much more clearly. And finally, when it comes to quantitative research, a piece of advice if you're doing a questionnaire study, the questionnaire must be in the appendix. If you're doing a questionnaire study, the questionnaire must be, no two things about it. The questionnaire must be in the appendix in some form. If you're doing a disclosure checklist, the disclosure checklist must be in the appendix. Okay, so these things are almost expected, and sometimes they don't appear at all, and that challenges a little bit what is the value of a research, and how to be able to therefore to address sometimes comments from reviewers on this basis. Right. That's it. I'll stop there, colleagues, and I probably I've gone too long, but I sort of hope it, I'm inviting questions in anything you would like to articulate. Um, I do not mean this to I do not mean this to mean that there's only one way of research. I'm not presenting this as this is either my way or the highway. There are different ways of approaching research, with different arguments to approach research. Um, uh, you know, so clearly there may be variations in what I'm saying that are perfectly acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Stephen.
No problem. Any comments or questions?
Thank you so much. I have a question.
Yes.
First of all, I would like to say really thank you for these clear and straightforward insights. I do have a question related to identifying research gaps, which
Yes.
honestly I often find to be a challenge whenever I try to develop, for example, a research proposal.
Mm-hmm.
So I always ask myself, what criteria can I use to determine whether this gap I want to address or this problem
Okay.
is it truly significant for advancing the field rather than just a minor omission? I mean, in other words, how can I distinguish between a gap caused by lack of research or one caused by deliberate scholarly choice or my own choice to out of curiosity to discover?
Yeah, it's a good question. I hope it's the right way to say
Yeah,
it.
it's Haya.
There's actually a slide I skipped for this slide because I usually start by saying to people, I give 5 minutes to people, 10 minutes to people, how do you come up with an idea? So, but I decided to skip it because of time, so I thought I won't do that. But you're right, you are in that stage of saying, well, how do I get an idea? How do I develop an idea? And of course, in our day and age, in academia as well, we are much more present with society around us. So therefore, what is happening outside should never be too far from what we are thinking of, right? So we should always be looking outside, what's happening, the news, the events, company scandals or whatever. Something usually triggers an interest, right? So, but still be there. As an academic, we need to remain, as academics, we try to remain curious about things, right? But then immediately the next step is, okay, something's happened. Oh, something about governance, something about accounting, something about whatever. Then I would tend to go and check the literature. So Scholar Google is my first point. I won't hide it. Scholar Google just is the first thing I would check. Is there anything written about this? There's something going on, there's a topic going on recently with a colleague. And it was really, really unusual. I said, okay, let's check. And we could find a couple of papers. So basically, in a sense, you have an idea at the beginning, and I'm thinking that your idea is always, valuable. It's not that you're looking at minute things. I would suggest that I would suspect people are always looking for something that is potentially valuable, potentially impactful. Then, of course, ambitions may have to go down. But at the start, I think people are not necessarily looking for that extra valuable that is missing in this model. I don't think necessarily we are into that. But then when you start reading the literature, and the best papers is sometimes literature review papers, very good literature review papers, not, the ones that are published in top journals, you know, Sometimes Haya, what I read is I read call for papers by top journals, right? Call for papers. You understand what I mean by call for papers?
Yeah.
Special issues, like there's a special issue at the moment, there's a special issue on governance in the digital age, so it's telling you what's happening to boards. Boards are becoming more AI, so in a sense, you are getting some understanding of what the literature, when you read a special issue call, it is basically telling you already what are the important questions perhaps going on in the literature. Okay, so this is a hack. This is a way around reading thousands of papers to come to the same conclusion. So you read the literature review papers, you read the special issue calls. There was one on family business a few years ago. Dalia, you will probably remember Hamad, and so I say, well, he was actually inspired by a special issue call on family business governance and family businesses. So he saw that special issue, he read it, and he think, oh yeah, that's it. So and then that allowed him to then get deeper into the papers and articles to get that meaningful gap, right? So in a sense, to answer your question is quite difficult, but I think if you look for the meaningful debates and gaps, you will see them in these papers, and that will take you in a direction where you're not necessarily just adding a variable. No offense to people who just add a variable. I mean, you can do that, but it's just the level of ambition that you're looking for. You might say, oh, it's maybe an important variable also, maybe an important aspect. So I'm not necessarily saying you can't do that. I'm not sure if I've answered the question.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Test it in terms of more and more now, and Dalia would probably know that more and more now I have new ideas. I am actually trying to ask myself, who would be interested in that finding? So let's say I want to do this research, Haya, or whatever. I want to do this research. And yes, there is a gap that looks meaningful, that looks interesting. Who would be the non-academic person interested in this? Could it be a regulator? Could it be the profession? Could it be NGOs? Could it be, and could I approach one of these people and say, I want to do this. What do you think? So you are hoping to get hopefully some validation that what you're trying to do will have or may have a non-academic readership, a non-academic interest. And that should tell you whether this is something worth kind of pursuing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. Good. Yeah, the slides. Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you, Terovin, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Hi, okay. My name is Rafat Jalad. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Business and Communication. I would like first to thank you for this very valuable and insightful lecture or workshop. I have a question, which is a practical one, concerning what kind of AI programs do we have we can rely upon for the literature review that you can advise or recommend?
You caught me here. I'm not an AI user yet. I'm just feeling too old for this. So I'm not the best expert. Yeah, I'll need to find out. If someone did tell me, I can ask someone, but I don't have. I still just do the classic way of looking at the literature. I mean, people say now you can ask ChatGPT. I mean, some people did that in the last workshop. They just wrote to ChatGPT and said, "Can you find me articles to do with this research?" And it did provide some answers around this. My only concern is that you need then to have sufficient understanding and confidence to know whether this makes sense or not, right? So yeah, but I'm not the best person on this account. And I'm not saying AI is useless. I'm just saying I have a problem with it. It's just I haven't necessarily gone in that direction. I see two hands up. Is that
Yeah.
okay? Yeah.
Nora, go ahead, Nora.
Yeah, hello everyone. Actually, no questions, but I have to say that on behalf of my fellow students and the professors as well present, and as a master's student at An-Najah National University, I would like to sincerely thank you for the invaluable knowledge and guidance you have so generously shared. So your clear and insightful explanation as well of the literature review has been extremely beneficial. And I like that sentence that is said to convey that interesting moment for the reader. So the reader is really important person and why I do that work is for the reader to track attention of the reader that reads my research. So thank you for time and thank you all for that interesting meeting as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nora. Another hand is up.
Yes,
Yeah.
how are you? Good evening.
Hi, Bella. Yes.
My question regarding the literature review. The literature
Yeah.
review, actually, we can see when review some article related to literature review, we can see everybody just try to embed the major contribution from the leading journal and high citation article. So how we can ignore the others? I mean, I can see some papers very interested and can lead me for excited framework or conceptual framework. But actually, as we hear and we know that more journals just try to accept the article when it's engaged with high citation and leading journals.
Yeah.
Second question related to quantitative or for literature is how much the researcher or the student he should input his practical and experience opinion in the argument. For
Okay.
example, if I have good experience in banking, so for example, I want to add my opinion in the article paper, but for example, maybe it will not be theoretical tested.
Okay. Right. So the first question, I think clearly we want to cite the top work. We want to cite the sort of well-cited work. One tricky bit in emerging economy is often some papers are interesting papers are not necessarily in the high cited journals. So someone said recently, I'm going to look only at Q1 articles or Q1 journals. Sorry, Q1 journals. And I said, yeah, but what you're going to end up is a very partial picture of the situation because there are Q2 journals publishing this topic and it's in B. So if you're going to say, oh, not many papers have been published in this area, or not many, we don't know enough about X and Y, that's not going to be a very strong set of arguments because you are sort of using an arbitrary Q1, Q2, or whatever. I mean, in a sense, you need to make a judgment that certain journals, even if they are Q2 or Q3 or whatever the number, that they tend to publish that topic. They tend to have some good. You need to make a judgment that some of them are good and they need to be cited. They need to be recognized, even though they're not necessarily at the high level, right? I think when you send a paper to a journal. Yes, but I don't think the journals, even the higher ranked journals, are sort of expecting you only to talk about the higher ranked ones. They expect you to cover the literature in a meaningful way. So I think keeping an open mind is important. You still need your critical skepticism about all those papers, whether they're Q1 or Q4, Q3. You need to look at them in a skeptical way. And so some of them may be still Q1, but actually nothing no good, and others maybe better, right? So I know it's harder to do that, but it's I think if you, I don't know if you're a student, but if you're a PhD student in a particular topic, you should try to read as much as possible. You should try to always understand as much as possible what is happening in that field, whether it is in X, Y, or Z journal. As long as you can make a judgment. Oh, I can see this paper is not really telling me anything new, and I'll move on to another one. Okay, that's number one. Sorry, I think I have a problem of memory. I can't remember the second question. Can you remind me of the second question? Oh, your
The
experience,
second
isn't it? Your
experience
experience.
and the practice.
Yes. So this is brilliant. This is what we call post-positivism, right? This is what we want to encourage all positivists to go into, is to accept that reality is not, the reality is not only constructed in this sort of objective sense, that there are other forms of viewpoints and perspective that exist. So post-positivism helps you to appreciate, and I actually, we encourage quantitative researchers to talk to the people on the ground. So you've done a research on accountants. Have you spoken to accountants? You've done a research on auditors. Have you spoken to auditors? You've done a research on banking. Have you spoken to the bankers? So I think you can refer to anecdotal evidence, you can refer to anecdotal cases within the boundaries of saying, look, I work there, so I know that certain things operate in this way. Okay. Or you may find other people or other sources or reports or other experts who are willing to say the same thing that you know. Right. So I think by any means, we should be encouraging more quantitative researchers to look at their findings, to look at their design by having interacted with the realities on the ground. And I can tell you, this makes a big difference when it comes to your interpretation of findings. It really it's a more convincing, confident way. Of course, you accept that my observations or these findings are anecdotal, but you can conjecture. The right word is conjecturing. You can conjecture that this could be the explanation behind this positive relation, negative relation, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Right, great. Any more questions?
So if no question, I have another question related to the literature review.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on set boundaries on working paper literature review? Do you need to be set up boundaries for scope and context, or should be an open discussion related to the subject?
Apologies, Bilal, I lost you for a minute. Can you repeat that?
I mean, in the literature review article or a paper, you need to set up on the boundaries, like in the scope and the context, or
Yeah.
you should drill up to end there. You find there is no new idea come up. You should read more and more until you find that no idea come up, new idea come up.
Yeah. Then that's time to start thinking elsewhere.
Yes.
I think Bilal, I think in many ways you develop a sort of over time a sort of nose for this. Is when people tell you I have this idea, so okay, let's listen to it, and then you kind of develop the idea. What do you expect out of that research? So if a literature, review demonstrate that there's already. I'm not saying that there's never a possibility of doing anything, but it's certainly you need to think of a different angle. And so qualitative research, that's why qualitative research is so good at this, because qualitative research, you can turn things around. For example, in qualitative research, you can say, yeah, I mean, we're not going to study if corruption exists. in this country X, right? We're not here to study if corruption exists. Corruption exists. But what we're trying to understand is why is it happening? Why is it, in what ways does it happen? How does it operate? How is it able to succeed where everywhere else perhaps it's not? So you kind of turn the question in a different way, process, how, you know, which is harder in quantitative research, because in quantitative research, you're always looking for that functionalist kind of relationship. So you can look at the literature and think maybe they're just using it, applying things in the wrong way, or using the sort of wrong measure. But it is sometimes challenging. I get the point on that. Any more comments?
I have another question, Terobin.
Yeah.
Concerning what is the role of the literature review or the differences between literature review done for a qualitative study versus quantitative study? Because we use here to have quantitative studies, not qualitative. And
Yeah, you have more quantitative studies. You have more quantitative studies. Yeah. So as I said, this is where having a table, the tabular aspect is often easier for quantitative studies. You use that to, as I showed in the slide, you have a list of those. I often, if I'm studying any sort of topic, governance, that sort of thing, I will have a table of that nature, and then it will tell me which context, which variables, which measures. So it is much more systematic in nature, so that I can identify, for example, debates about variables, but the variables do not lead to a particular, do not lead to a particular result. It can allow me to look at context. Different contexts have been studied, but not other contexts, and these contexts are interesting for some reason, right? So that is often at the beginning of any sort of quantitative type research. Then, as I said, I would tend to use this to develop a hypothesis. So my hypotheses are much more at the core of it, because for example, I just finished a paper. It's just coming out on GAE. It's on open access. You can look at it. It's a paper on corporate governance. Do revisions to corporate governance codes matter? Right. So I mean, by making new codes every time, by revising those codes, do they really bring any substantial change? Right. So sort of we problematize. So we read the literature. There's a lot of literature on code and then what happens, but not much literature around what happens when you have multiple codes. So that's sometimes we look for these sort of nuances in the literature to be able to say, and then that was a main argument underlying the study of a change in regulation and how the code change board structures and impact on performance and so on. So it's still a paper about governance and performance, in fact. But at the outset, the argumentation was very much around code revisions. What happens to code revision? I think the literature review helps you to really refine, I think, basically what hypothesis would be more valuable, what hypothesis would be more interesting. That's what I use it for often, because we're not going to test again, for example, board size. Well, we know already about board size, but what do we know about that level of? So we are able to do that in that way. Qualitative research is totally different. Qualitative research is much more phenomena based, so it's like what's going on there. So as long as we can make an argument at the beginning that understanding of inside the black box, the phenomena so the two things are quite different when you try to justify it with the literature.
But we need reading literature review for qualitative studies also? I think yes.
Yes.
And
yes.
Yeah,
of course. I think you use for both. I think I'm sorry if I'm misunderstanding, but I didn't mean that you cannot. It's just how you use it. It's how you kind of depend on it, how you developed it, because of course qualitative research is much more about phenomena theoretically, a theoretical, a new phenomena, a theoretical explanation of that phenomena. So you're trying to bring a different sort of contribution to the literature. As I said, we're not going to find corruption is existing. We know corruption exists, but why is that happening? So that's the sort of, and we do that quite a lot. Yeah. No, we use literature in both, and I think in many ways, reading qualitative work as a quantitative researcher sometimes gives ideas, because that was one of the reasons we say qualitative research brings around new phenomena, new variables maybe to think of, right? And then we try to measure that variable, and then we try to do a study with that variable. So it's also connected in a way. Yeah.
No. Thank you.
Good, no problem. Yeah. So, is there
Do we
any
have
other
other-
questions? I'm open. I'm not in a hurry, but you said the slides have already been circulated. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So that's fine. I don't have to worry about that.
So, hi, Doctor.
Yeah.
So again, to return to slides, I can see there is two approach for literature review. The argument regarding the author-centric or the concept-centric.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I have just a little suggestion. I'm not going to discuss the author-centric. I mean, in the literature review, as my understanding, I'm going to discuss the theme and the concept-centric. So, which one you prefer? Which approach?
I think as long as you're able to, I suppose we're interested in the concept, we're understanding the concept. I think when I mentioned the author-centric kind of idea was more around definitional ideas. It could be there are different debates around what governance is, for example, or what are the limits or boundaries of governance. So you may have a sort of where this is much more around different perspectives and authors. Yeah. So this is a totally different kind of objective, if you want, right? So for instance, even what is corporate governance? If you kind of start from the Cadbury all the way to how it is defined in different settings now by the different authors, you will find different perspectives around this. Okay. But I take your point. I think if you're doing a quantitative research, you might be more interested around the thematics, around the themes. Okay. So what sort of themes that you're trying to study? I was trying to find an example, in a sense, to underpin that. I'm just trying to find an example I could use to show this. Give me a second. This is on. One second. I'm just trying to get the paper. Right. Okay, I've got it now. So if I'm taking a particular angle, a particular concept here, so this is an example. Not I mean, obviously it's a plug for the paper, and it's available free, so you can have a look. So always a chance to always talk about research. So this is what the paper has just come out. Revising the code, does it matter for both diversity and corporate performance? So these are kind of two questions we're trying to understand. When we revise a code, does it really change diversity, and does it make an impact on performance? And so I'm sort of, obviously there is the introduction where we try to argue the case for the literature, and to be fair, there's lots of paper on that, so it's quite, you always have to try to find a way to argue that. But then as you will see, immediately I'm come to my literature review and my hypothesis development. Then the first thing I'm interested is, because the first question is, do codes really affect diversity, right? Do the codes say we should have more women, or we should have more balanced and more diverse board? So clearly my first part is this. And you can see, therefore, it's thematic in nature. It's taking the issue, which is, do corporate governance code impact on diversity? And then I write, obviously, you know, what's happening with what's happening in a country X, what's happening in country Y, what's happening in country Z, and various reforms. And therefore, basically, what the tension might be, that there's a high degree of compliance or a very low degree of compliance. Okay, and then that leads to my hypothesis. Okay, so this is the thematic number one, if you want, right? So my paper is very much around the first thematic. Then there's a second thematic, which is the effect of board diversity on corporate performance. Again, a very big literature, you can imagine, very, very, very big literature on this. And again, here so in this section, the potential positive and negative effects are discussed, because we can argue that there's a tension that diversity is either a good thing for the business or a bad thing for the business, because if you have commonality of views, it might be better to run the company. If you have diversity of views, you may have a lot of disagreements, and therefore things don't operate very effectively. So again, we write around that. Okay, so we sort of discuss what implications in that. And then we talk about we go specifically on financial performance, because that is the first hypothesis we're going to look at. The second hypothesis we're going to look at there is financial performance, and then the classic sort of debates, contrast between what we have found in different countries and so on and so forth. And then also there's one on the moderation. Here in this case, as I told you in the paper, in the presentation, we are now making more of a moderating effect. You know, what could be the impact of the code effect on this? You know, does having the code makes a difference or not? And another one on sustainability performance, and we've got H3 here and H3B. So we got three hypotheses, but let's say in the end we are testing, because we're testing for sustainability performance as well as financial performance. Does that make sense what I'm trying to show here, Bilal, or is it?
Yes, thank you. Thank you too much.
Yeah. So this is what I'm trying to say. By obviously it is by thematic, it is by this, and so this is the literature review. That's it, right? That is the literature review, but it is embedded with the hypothesis, and the theoretical discussion is happening at the same time, right? So it's all embedded in there. You know, we're not trying to write theory and then this and then that. We just try to kind of bring it together so that it has all of this together as a sort of perspective to underpin your hypothesis. Feel free to have a look. I'm not saying it's a brilliant brilliant work, but it's just something we've because as you try to publish in this crowded literature, you may find it you know, obviously you have to keep thinking about what sort of contribution could you make within the sort of it's much harder. It's much harder. I have to admit.
Any question, dear colleagues, left for Professor Terevan? I think our colleagues are done for tonight.
Okay. It's a bit late, no? At this point.
Oh, okay for us. The start of the nightlife here in Palestine.
Yeah, it's 10 p.m. Is that right? Nearly 10 p.m.
Yes, almost. Yeah, 10 p.m.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I imagine. Probably my time to get dinner as well, but because we eat a bit early here. But I know the tradition of eating a bit late.
For sure. Thank you very much, Terevan. I would like to thank you
No
again.
problem. I hope it was helpful in some way.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, for sure. And I hope this will be the first and not the last cooperation between us. And I would like to thank Dr. Dalia as our ex-colleagues and now our ambassador in the UK for her continuous support and for organizing this series of sessions. And we hope that in the future we'll have another session with you and other colleagues in the UK. Thank you very much. I would like to thank my colleagues also for being here tonight, and also the thanks for Dr. Shada Arafat for her continuous support and organizing these sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for
Thank
inviting me.
you.
All the
Stephen.
best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Dalia.
Stephen, see you. Bye.
See you somewhere.
Yeah, hopefully.
Hopefully closer than
Yes.
than Indonesia.
Yes, definitely. See you.
All right. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Bye-bye.